Good evening, BookTube, or morning, wherever this finds you. There's a fine rain outside for me, and of course, I'm always by a highway, so apologies if there are motor sounds. Hopefully, that will add to the experience. It would be nice if I could get some parrots sometime, some real Colombian feel, but you never know. You work with what you have. So today, I promised you in a past video that we were going to talk about another influence for this novel that you can see beside me, Children of Doro, which is out May 4th, because yes, I have been shouting from the rooftops, essentially, Dostoevsky in space, Dostoevsky in space. But as much as we've discussed in other episodes how Dostoevsky was informed by Christianity, obviously a foundation of his culture and his civilization, I had to admit, obviously, I was informed by a cultural canon too, even as I was creating the Sunmaster's Journey, which is the canon within my world. The whole construct of my science fictional universe has an origin. Of course it does. And what would that origin be for me? What would my influence be when trying to write a book about philosophy and how to do better in the world? Gosh, what possible science fiction series would have influenced me? I am a Trekkie. I was raised a Trekkie. I was always raised with Trek. So I cannot remember a first Trek moment. It was always part of my life. I'm part of the generation that watched TNG when it first aired, and because we had VCRs, I was responsible for popping in those little tiny VCR tapes and then time coding them after, so you could always find the right episode after. I knew every Trek episode by name. Obviously, when DS9 started too, and there was overlap, then there were two different libraries that had to be gone into. I grew up with Trek. What does it mean to grow up with that era of Trek, with Next Generation in particular and DS9 a little bit later on? It means growing up with an era of Trek that first and foremost was very much appealing to a certain white middle-class aesthetic, because it's so cute that in this far-flung future century, everyone's so fascinated by everything that's happened in the 20th century. They have the same sort of interests that one would expect from middle-class white Westerners in the 20th century. This is true to a lot of science fiction. Science fiction of the future often flatters the present by coding it, the future, with all kinds of antiques and curious references that are supposed to make us feel like we are living in a time that will be remembered and that will be cherished. It is arrogant as all get out, but it is a common move to make people feel familiar and comfortable in that future. And we'll talk maybe in another episode about some of the problems with that when we transpose too much of the present into our future thinking, how it can really crush us. I'll give you one quick example. I have a hard time with any work that's set in a far-flung future where a character has to struggle to come out with a different sexual orientation, because I know those books are supposed to provide stories that can comfort and help somebody moving through that in our moment, but I read it and I think, oh, great, in the year 3000, we're still going to be dealing with that. So experience varies in terms of how flattering it can be to see the present played out in the future. More on that in another episode. So, Star Trek, the idea of the Federation, is so filled with optimism. You have a post-scarcity economy where basic items can be provided for thanks to new technology. And the idea is, because of this, people can actually focus on what they want to do. They can focus on pursuing their passions. They can dabble. They also don't really need to be on career paths quite the same way that we are today. A lot of them still choose career paths. But if you want to be a little bit more of a wanderer and explore and see what's out there, what's stopping you? You live in a post-scarcity society. So it explores the idea of what happens if we take away people's basic subsistence level fears and provide opportunities for something more. The complicated part of the series is also one of its strengths, and that it builds from the original series, is that it imagines these confluences of diverse species within the Federation interacting with species outside the Federation. So even if you have your species, your organization ostensibly on the path to a better justice, to a more equal society, how will that sense of equality and how will that sort of optimism manifest itself when one has to deal with civilizations that have taken different paths? And a really important question, which comes out especially in DS9, is can the Federation sustain even the level of utopic thinking it has, the optimism and the equality it has, when faced with other kinds of civilizations and other ways of being? Or will that challenge not so much require, but trigger something in us that is still profoundly human, profoundly built on a different evolutionary cycle that maybe was not prepared yet for living in a more egalitarian way? Will it inspire something in us that will in fact ruin the entire project? DS9 goes into that in a much deeper way, with the Dominion War, with the Cardassians, with questions of who we have to become to protect our society against outside threat, and what kind of society will remain when it is protected, quote unquote, from outside threat. These are huge questions, and I won't say that Star Trek always solves them in quite the correct manner or the best manner, but it raises those questions and it holds ideas in tension in a way that really trained me well. I think that when I talk about Dostoevsky holding ideas in tension, that's a very humanist concept. It's also a concept intrinsic to a humanities education, and it's a concept that comes up often in the Next Generation, where different points of view are presented and held together. And you'll have characters who are passionate. They have a sense of righteousness. They know they are on the side of right. But sometimes there's also an acceptance of limits. There's a very important episode in which, I'm not even going to say the name of the episode because I don't want to spoil it for anybody. I know it's a few decades late for spoiling, but we'll just talk about the concept so you can go back and enjoy it if you'd like to, without knowing what's coming. But there is a world that has been destroyed, and then suddenly two life forms seem to still be persisting on the surface. The Enterprise shows up to help them, and Picard realizes in the course of the away mission to try to help these two who don't want to leave, who want to stay, that there weren't actually survivors of the species that used to live there. They were obliterated by another species, and we don't know which species obliterated them because a kind of godlike figure had made himself man, brought himself down to live and to love among that world, and he had survived the attack, the obliteration, but in his rage, he not only destroyed the other species, he eradicated all memory of the species from the continuum entirely. And this is important because at the end, Picard has to recognize he can't even begin to fathom the extent of the crime that was committed here, let alone pass judgment on it. It is beyond his reach. Maybe the Q continuum has something to say and could help out there, but there is the sense that no matter how prepared you are, no matter how much you think that you have a lock on what is just, there will always be situations that challenge that deep, strong conviction. Now, after DS9, we moved into territory a little bit wobblier with Voyager, and then Enterprise was just so unfortunate. I was quite furious because the way that Seven was treated in Voyager made clear that they were trying to shift to an eye candy approach, kind of really annoying for the series, cynical, playing to lowest common denominator. And they continued that with the treatment of the ridiculous sexual tension. Just the nonsense. Enterprise did not work for me. If it worked for you, okay. We accept all types in this universe. And more recent Treks have gone in very different directions. Obviously, Brave New Worlds definitely feels... Strange New Worlds, sorry. Based on Brave New World, for Shakespearean reference, goes back to original series and has that aesthetic. Not so much the cinematography. It's not great in terms of its staging, unfortunately, but a lot of its plot lines and a lot of its approach to the material and the tension that it holds, the way that it presents different points of view and allows the viewers to sit with them more or less. There are a couple episodes where they rush. Promising. But there is something that was never quite brought forward from the Next Generation. And we're not even going to talk about Picard, which is just for some nostalgia viewing, but also sometimes a little bit of a hate watch. Very painful. I was so upset by it that I started writing my own revisionist fanfic. So we won't talk about that for too much. But before then, there was this gap. There was this gap with very little Trek after Enterprise and before the modern series with Discovery, which just leaned into what if we had, Federation, but it wasn't a utopia? What if it was always kind of mean and nasty? Kind of missing the point of the original series, which again in DS9 held that line perfectly by holding people in a sense of self-righteousness, thinking that they are on the side of a better order, even if sometimes that order is deeply compromised. Wonderful tensions in Deep Space Nine, and prior to that, in some episodes of Next Generation. Gosh, I hope you can't hear all the trucks that I hand, but two of them just passed by and they tooted at each other. So that's cute. Little machines beeping at each other. So the gap, in that gap, we also had some films which had their own major problems, lots of whitewashing, and also a lot of anxiety. You could see in the post-9/11 world anxieties about we can't have two male characters who are too close to each other unless, one of them has a girlfriend. Oh boy, we have lost so much. You go back to the original series, you see proper, compassionate male friendships that are open and filled with connectivity and touch and care and crying and worrying about other people on away missions. And then this cult of a very rigid, contained, individualist masculinity that doesn't allow for that kind of tenderness and friendship grew up in our society, and it was really made manifest in certain aspects of the films. But they were shiny, and they had lots of lens flare. In that time period, I remember thinking about, boy, I would have loved to have been able to write another Trek. Not possible. Canadians, I remember I was looking into writing Star Trek novels at one point in my young career, but the sites all said you had to be a U.S. resident, you had to be a U.S. citizen, one of the two, resident or citizen, so no go there. And that was early in my career, so that was still a long way off. But I always thought to myself that one of the better treatments of the aesthetics and the themes in Next Generation and Deep Space Nine to carry forward would probably show up in a show about a medical ship or an emergency rescue vehicle of some kind, probably I was thinking a medical science ship in the wake of the destruction of Romulus. And the idea of when you have a planet just blown up with all of its refugees scattered, if you had a ship that suddenly was pulled from its original mission, medical or science-oriented or a mix of both, into the fray of a whole bunch of competing factions and tensions That could be really interesting. That could be really potent. It would tie into a lot of the work that Deep Space Nine was already doing. So that was my idea. This medical science ship in the wake of the destruction of Romulus and what could have come out of that. Would have been fun. But the fun thing about being a sci-fi writer, and a published one for their own original work, is that you can carry those ideas forward to other pieces, which is what I have always told people to do. Let any given story go. If the theme is true, it will come back to you. And this particular theme, this desire to have a concept that is dear to me, this playing field of Trek, the idea of a society aspirationally moving toward the stars and trying to figure out how it can negotiate its own aspirations in a world that maybe doesn't always share them, that could play out in other spaces, and has. So there is a lot of my concept of a kind of federation in the partnership for this novel. And I do have a planet that gets blown up, and I do have a crew that is navigating rescue and the trauma of rescue in its wake. So I feel like I've satisfied a little part of that, but not completely, which is why my next series, and I say series for the next one, I think it is going to be more than one book, Thucydides in Space, the one that will be based on the Peloponnesian War, will be based in part on a narrator that I am likening to Thucydides, because Thucydides is a character. We'll talk about that another time. And the other parts will be played out by a medical science crew. Done. And that's what you can do. You can carry this forward. So I even have an Easter egg, obviously. There is a passage in Children of Doro that screams Star Trek. You'll know it when you see it, and I won't spoil it because it's later on. There's also a section where my ship's AI talks about the adventures that the ship and its captain has had in their time together before the major crisis, so the good old days. And that page reads like Star Trek too. So I am definitely informed by my context, and my context, my life has been Trek. I honestly cannot remember a time before I watched Trek. It has been a foundational part of my sci-fi experience. It would be very strange if it didn't inform my writing. It does. And maybe it does yours too. But irrespective of whether or not it was a key part of your childhood, the concept still holds that these are phenomenal playing fields we are given in science fiction and fantasy. Whatever was formative for you as a younger reader, or maybe as an older reader, coming to science fiction and just being blown away by a new world or a new concept, and there's so many wonderful ones out there. The key is that if the world leads you to a sense of dissatisfaction, if you feel you're at the limit of what the text can do, yeah, sure, fan fiction can soothe the beast for a bit, but try to take it forward. If you aren't already writing yourself, but you feel very moved by ideas that have come to you through science fiction and fantasy, try to find some space for them. Maybe in science fiction and fantasy, maybe in some other kind of writing, maybe in some other medium entirely, but carry it forward. Because if there is anything from the core concept of Star Trek, especially the Next Generation, that I think holds through in all its iterations, it is that sense of moving forward, and of there being more to explore and to name and to catalog and to understand. And that is a tension that we need to hold in balance with our present moment all the time. Because as grim and bleak as things can see in any given era, if we hold in tension the idea that we are still moving forward, we can provide ourselves with the strength needed to imagine better worlds to come. Thank you again for listening. Yes, again, under 20 minutes, so I'll let it be. And by all means, if you are a fellow Trekkie, share some of your Trek thoughts about what resonates with you and what doesn't. Or if not, let me know what your foundational texts were and how they have informed your sense of philosophy and moving through the world. Thanks so much for your time. Cheers.